have the floor.
All right, thank you so much, and hi everybody. Welcome to this webinar on best practices in demonstrating evidence. I'm Sarah Yu, I'm the Program Impact Manager for AmeriCorps State and National, and I'm joined here in the room by Roshni Menon, who is Research Analyst in the Office of Research and Evaluation. We will be sharing quite a bit of information with you today, but we encourage you to go ahead and ask questions as well if you have them. So feel free to use that question and answer box and type your questions in any time during this webinar. We'll pause as we need to answer them as we go through, and we'll also have time for questions at the end of the presentation. Here is the outline for today's webinar. I will start by talking about CNCS's approach to evidence, then talk about the evidence-based criteria in the 2020 Notice of Funding Opportunity, which we call the NOFO. I'll share specific details about the evidence tiers and the evidence quality standards, and then I'll close with a few tips for applicants. And then, as I say, Roshni and I are here to answer any questions you have about how to demonstrate evidence in an AmeriCorps application. So the reason why evidence is important to AmeriCorps State and National, I can probably sum up in just a few words. We want to fund what works. In other words, it's important to us that the activities supported by AmeriCorps grants are effective in addressing community needs. And this is a shared goal because we know it's important to you as well to make a meaningful difference in solving problems within your communities. Evidence is that essential link between what you as the applicant are proposing to do and the outcomes you intend to achieve. When there's strong evidence, solid evidence, supporting your program model, it gives CNCS confidence that we can invest federal dollars, invest AmeriCorps member resources into your project, and those dollars and resources will be used wisely to make a real difference in your community. We also believe that evidence should be a tool for your program as you grow and mature to figure out how to make continuous improvements as you go along to increase the effectiveness of what you do. Even in the most carefully designed program model, there are inevitably going to be aspects that are more effective and aspects that are less effective. And evidence can help you distinguish between those things and do more of what works and less of what doesn't work as well. Because of the value and importance of evidence for AmeriCorps, it plays a significant role in AmeriCorps State and National grant competitions. All activities supported by AmeriCorps grants, we also call those activities interventions, must be supported by evidence in some way. This is what we call a threshold issue. Applicants that are not able to demonstrate a minimum level of evidence to support their program design will not be considered for funding. I'll say more on a later slide about how we define that threshold. On the very first page of the NOFO, if you have looked at it, it says AmeriCorps grants are awarded to eligible organizations proposing to engage AmeriCorps members in evidence-based or evidence-informed interventions or practices to strengthen communities. By evidence-informed, we mean that the applicant is basing their program design on available knowledge, research, and evaluation from related projects. The exact proposed activities themselves might not have been evaluated yet, but evidence from similar activities has guided the design of the program. In contrast, evidence-based means that the exact intervention proposed in the application has already been rigorously evaluated. And that word rigorously has a particular meaning. I'll talk more about that in a moment. So rigorously evaluated, and the evaluation shows that the intervention is effective in achieving the outcomes the applicant wants to achieve. Now, getting from evidence-informed to evidence-based is something that takes place in stages. The first stage, which you see in that first box over on the left, is to identify a promising program design. As I mentioned, this should be based on available knowledge, research, and evaluation from related projects. The second stage, the next box over, is to make sure that this program design is implemented effectively and consistently. A process evaluation that would be a good tool to help you figure out whether or not this is being done well. The third stage, moving over to the right, is to assess program outcomes. And you should do this by building high-quality data collection protocols supported by good instruments, surveys, tests, interview questions, etc., and that are able to measure outcomes in a valid and consistent way. You may recognize this as part of the performance measurement requirements for all AmeriCorps programs. We had a webinar a couple weeks ago, or a week ago, I guess, on best practices in developing performance measures. If you missed that webinar, then you can look at the recorded webinar on the AmeriCorps NOFO page. The fourth and fifth stages are to use evaluation to look at whether or not you are achieving what you set out to do in the program. You might start out with a non-experimental outcome evaluation, that's described in stage 4 here, that gives you a first look at whether or not your program is as effective as you hoped. If you see positive results at this stage, then you can move on to a type of evaluation that can assess causality. In other words, it can look at whether or not your program activities are actually causing the outcomes you're seeing. This requires types of evaluation designs called experimental or quasi-experimental. We collectively refer to those kinds of evaluations as impact evaluations. Once an impact evaluation has shown meaningful and significant positive results for program outcomes, that's stage 5, your program can be considered evidence-based. That may sound like a long journey, and frankly it can be. CNCS recognizes that it takes time to build evidence, and that depending on where you are in your program lifecycle, you might not be ready to conduct the kind of impact evaluation that would qualify you to be considered evidence-based. It's also a common thing for programs to intentionally loop back on this cycle as part of their continuous learning and improvement. So for example, outcome data or the results from some initial evaluation might show that the program needs to be modified, changed, in order to be more effective. And that change may be significant enough that the program needs to kind of start over with evaluation, and that would put an applicant back at stage 1 or 2. And that is okay, that's fine. That is the process as it's designed, and there's value in all stages of this continuum. CNCS funds grantees at every stage in this continuum. We don't only fund stage 5 programs, so just be aware that this is a process of building and developing evidence that supports your program model. Now, it is helpful to know that there is a way to leapfrog up to stage 5, and that would be to identify an existing evidence-based program design and replicate it. And that means implement it exactly the way it was designed. If you do that, you would also be considered an evidence-based program. But be careful, this is not as easy as it sounds. It takes a lot of work, very careful work, to ensure genuine fidelity to a program model. And I mentioned process evaluation earlier. A process evaluation is an essential tool in replication to make sure that you're doing it right. If you want to learn more about the evidence continuum and how it relates to program design and evaluation efforts, on the bottom of this slide there is a link to a video that will walk you through this in 5 minutes, so I recommend that to you. In order for an applicant to be assessed as evidence-based, the evidence presented by that applicant needs to be for the same intervention described in the application. Those words are underlined on this slide. You will hear me say that a lot during this webinar, this concept of same intervention. That could mean that you're providing evidence from your own AmeriCorps program, which by definition is the same intervention, or, as I just discussed on the last slide, it could mean that you're using evidence from a different program that you are replicating with fidelity at your own site. Either way, you need to be able to prove, to show in your application, that the intervention described in the submitted evidence and the intervention you are describing in your application are the same. And by same, we mean that the intervention needs to match in 5 characteristics. You'll see those on the slide here. Characteristics of the beneficiary population, that's the population that you're serving. Characteristics of the population delivering the intervention, that may be AmeriCorps members or volunteers. Dosage, by which we mean the frequency and duration of the program activities. And design of the intervention, including all of its key components. the setting in which the intervention is delivered, and the outcomes of the intervention. Why do these dimensions have to match? Well, it's to make sure that the evidence you're presenting is actually applicable to what you are planning to do. If any of these characteristics are significantly different, then it means that the outcomes of your proposed activity can't necessarily be expected to be the same as the outcomes shown in the evidence. You could make a reasonable hypothesis that the outcomes might be the same, but the evidence itself doesn't provide conclusive proof of this. So your proposed project would be considered to be evidence-informed, not evidence-based. In order for reviewers to assess whether all these dimensions match, you need to provide complete descriptions of both interventions, the one proposed in the application and the one that was evaluated in the reports you're submitting as evidence. Since the definition of same intervention is based on 5 aspects, 5 dimensions, you need to describe all 5 of them clearly in both the application and in the evidence reports. If one or more of these dimensions doesn't sufficiently match, the report won't count as evidence for the application. When assessing the strength of the evidence supporting an application, CNCS reviewers look at 2 things: evidence tier and evidence quality. Both of these are described in detail in the NOFO and the Mandatory Supplemental Guidance. So these are the fundamental guidance documents that you should read carefully and should refer to. But here's a quick summary. Evidence tier refers to the strength or rigor of the evidence presented to support the application. This is roughly analogous to those different stages in the evidence continuum you saw on that previous slide. The more rigorous the evidence, the higher it would land on that evidence continuum, the more points an application will receive for evidence tier. Evidence that supports a cause-effect or causal relationship between the intervention and positive program outcomes will receive the most points for tier, because this gives CNCS the highest degree of certainty that the federal investment will lead to the desired outcomes. Evidence rigor needs to be accompanied by evidence quality. There are several dimensions of quality that reviewers assess, and what exactly those dimensions are depends on the applicant's assigned evidence tier. For evidence-informed programs, so that would be on the left side of the evidence continuum, quality refers to the relevance of the evidence and the extent to which it has guided the applicant's program design. For evidence-based programs, the ones on the right of the continuum, quality refers to how well the evaluation of the program was implemented. For both types, evidence-informed and evidence-based programs, the meaningfulness of the positive results shown by the evidence are an important part of evidence quality because this supports the value of the program design. And the recency of the evidence, how recently it was completed, is also important to make sure that it continues to be applicable to the current situation. In the next several slides, we'll take a more detailed look at the evidence tiers defined in the 2020 Mandatory Supplemental Guidance. Those tiers are pre-preliminary, preliminary, moderate, or strong. If any of you on the webinar today applied last year for AmeriCorps state and national grants, these evidence tiers are the same as they were in 2019. You can find the full definitions for all the tiers by following the link on the slide that leads you to the Mandatory Supplemental Guidance document. Now, I mentioned earlier that CNCS funds programs at every stage on the evidence continuum. I just want to re-emphasize that point here. What you're looking at on this slide is a graph that shows the evidence tiers for successful new and recompeting applicants in 2017, that's blue on the graph, 2018 in orange, and 2019 in green. You'll see here that the largest number of funded applicants in each year, just less than half, are in the pre-preliminary evidence tier. That's the evidence-informed stage of things. So if you aren't yet at a stage where you can call yourself an evidence-based program, please don't let that discourage you from applying for funding. CNCS values evidence-informed programs as well, and we also value programs that are still on their journey toward becoming evidence-based. The pre-preliminary evidence tier corresponds to those evidence-informed program models. These are applicants that don't have direct evidence for the specific, precise intervention described in the application, and so they're not able to submit any outcome or impact evaluation reports. Instead, the applicant needs to describe how the intervention is guided by available knowledge, research, and evaluation from related projects. If there is previous performance measure data from the program, then this should also be described along with how that data has been used to guide the proposed intervention. All of these descriptions need to be entered in the application narrative itself. If your application is informed by evidence, but is not actually replicating the same intervention described in the evidence, do not submit any reports or studies as attachments. Reports that are not of the same intervention described in the application will not be reviewed or receive any points. I mentioned a threshold requirement earlier in this webinar, so let's go back to that. As it says in the NOFO, all AmeriCorps programs must be either based on or informed by evidence. For applicants in the pre-preliminary evidence tier, these are applicants that don't yet have an evaluation or evidence that supports their exact program model. It needs to be clear in the application narrative that the program design is indeed evidence-informed. And if this is not clear, in other words, if the applicant's description of the evidence that guided their program design is not of sufficient quality, then the applicant will not meet the threshold and will not be considered for funding. On this slide is a brief example of a hypothetical applicant that would be assessed as being in the pre-preliminary evidence tier. And I'll read the example here on the slide. Applicants' Ready to Read program provides small group tutoring services to 5th grade students for 30 minutes twice a week. This program is adapted from famous tutoring programs, Successful Approach, which use the same curriculum to provide one-on-one tutoring sessions for 30 minutes every day. A 2017 randomized controlled trial found that students in the famous tutoring program increased their scores on standardized tests by 40% more than the control group. Little note at the bottom here, no additional documents, meaning no reports or studies were submitted by the applicant. A couple things to point out here in this example. First of all, the description says that the program is adapted from famous tutoring programs' Successful Approach, not replicating their approach. And you can see in the description that the type of tutoring, which is small group in the Ready to Read program, and the frequency, twice a week, is different from the daily one-on-one services provided by that famous tutoring program. There may be really good reasons why the applicant has modified the intervention. Maybe their school partners have asked them to use a different approach, or maybe they are serving a different type of population. However, the changes mean it is not the same intervention. So this is an evidence-informed program, not an evidence-based program. This is why it's assessed as pre-preliminary. Because it's not the same intervention, you'll notice that the applicant did not submit that randomized controlled trial study that they mentioned in this example. Instead, they did the appropriate thing, which is to describe it in the application narrative. The description makes it clear that the evidence from famous tutoring program did inform the applicant's program design, and you can tell that because they are choosing to use the same curriculum. It's also clear from the description that the evidence is relatively recent, from 2017, and also had a meaningful positive effect on program participants. Moving on to the preliminary evidence tier. This is for applicants who are progressing toward becoming evidence-based, in that they have started evaluating the outcomes of their intervention. Applicants who are assessed as being in the preliminary evidence tier have submitted one or more non-experimental outcome evaluation reports to accompany their application. Non-experimental in this case means that if a comparison group was used, it wasn't randomly assigned or statistically matched, so there isn't proof that the comparison group was equivalent to the treatment group before the intervention. To reiterate what I said earlier, and you'll hear this again a lot from me, the submitted report needs to be of the same intervention described in the application, not just an intervention that is kind of similar. That's not enough. And the report also has to show positive results for at least one outcome that is part of the applicant's logic model. A report that shows no effect or that shows positive effects for something that's unrelated to the applicant's program design doesn't actually provide any useful evidence to support the applicant's intervention. Here's an example of a hypothetical applicant that would be in the preliminary evidence tier. Applicant's ready-to-read program provides small group tutoring services to 5th grade students for 30 minutes twice a week. Based on pre- and post-assessments administered by the Ready-to-Read program in 2017, 350 students gained at least 1.5 grade levels in reading mastery. The effect sizes were significant and represent a positive result. Note on additional documents, the applicant submitted one internal evaluation report of the Ready-to-Read program describing the results of the pre-post assessment. So the applicant submitted an outcome evaluation report from their own program. It is the same intervention. The report does not have a matched comparison or control group, so it's a non-experimental evaluation. But it does show positive results on the key outcome of reading mastery. So this qualifies the applicant for the preliminary evidence tier. A couple other things the applicant did well in this example. They not only submitted the evidence report as an attachment, but they also described the evidence in the application narrative. Describing the full body of evidence, including describing any submitted reports or studies, in the evidence-based section of the application is explicitly required by the 2020 NOFO for all evidence tiers. And it's important information to help reviewers fully assess the applicant's evidence. So that's one thing the applicant did well. Also, the report was from 2017. Again, that means it's relatively recent. That's good. And the applicant shared information about effect size to demonstrate that the results shown in the evaluation report were meaningful. One note of caution here is that it's not possible to tell just from the description how well the evaluation design was actually implemented, or whether the effect size determination was methodologically correct. These dimensions of evidence quality would be assessed by looking at the text of the evaluation report itself, the one that's submitted as an attachment. Unfortunately, we can't do that as part of this webinar example, but that is an aspect of the actual review of these applications. The moderate evidence tier is the first of two evidence tiers that apply to evidence-based applicants. In order to qualify for the moderate evidence tier, applicants have to submit at least one independent, that means externally conducted, impact evaluation. An impact evaluation is defined in the Mandatory Supplemental Guidance. It means that it provides statistical evidence of how well a program achieves its desired outcomes compared to what would have happened in the absence of the program. In other words, this kind of evaluation is designed to show a causal relationship between activities and outcomes. The two types of evaluation design that are able to show this causality are randomized controlled trials, RCTs for short, or quasi-experimental design, QED for short, evaluations. The difference between the moderate evidence tier and its sister tier, the strong evidence tier, relates to how broadly applicable or generalizable the findings are. An applicant with moderate evidence might have conducted an RCT or QED evaluation on just a single site or with one particular population. This means that the findings may or may not be applicable in other locations or with other populations. This is different than the strong evidence tier, which we'll talk about shortly. Just like in the preliminary evidence tier, it's essential that the submitted reports are, here it is again, of the same intervention described in the application. It's also essential that the reports show positive results for one or more key outcomes in the applicant's logic model. If either of these two things does not apply to a particular report, that report is not going to contribute to the applicant's assigned evidence tier. Here's an example of a hypothetical applicant who would be assessed as being in the moderate evidence tier. The applicant's ready-to-read program uses the same curriculum, program design, and dosage as the famous tutoring program, and is serving similar students. Based on a 2017 quasi-experimental evaluation conducted by Famous Tutoring Program at one of their program sites, students gained on average 1.3 grade levels on the Famous Standardized Literacy Assessment, compared to just 0.8 grade levels for the comparison group. The study was conducted by an independent external evaluator, and the results were significant, p-value less than 0.05. In the additional documents category, the applicant submitted one independent evaluation report from the Famous Tutoring Program describing the results of the QED study. So notice that the applicant didn't submit an evaluation report from their own program. Instead, they submitted one from someone else's program instead. However, it's clear from the description that the applicant is in fact replicating the Famous Tutoring Program. They're implementing it in exactly the way it was designed and the way it was evaluated. So the submitted evaluation report is for the same intervention and will be considered as part of determining the evidence tier. This is different from the adaptation we saw in the pre-preliminary example, where key elements of the intervention had been changed, and so it no longer met the same intervention definition. The description here indicates that the report is a recent QED evaluation. In other words, it's an impact evaluation that showed meaningful and statistically significant positive effects on literacy. However, it was from a single program site, which means it may not be broadly generalizable to other sites. And this is why the applicant would be assessed in the moderate evidence tier, not the strong evidence tier. As in the case of the preliminary evidence tier example, to look at the quality of the evidence in greater detail, that will need to be assessed by looking at the text of the submitted evaluation report itself. So now we come to the strong evidence tier. This is the highest tier. It includes applicants that are evidence-based and whose evidence is broadly applicable in a variety of settings. In other words, the evidence is generalizable beyond the study context. Applicants reach this level of evidence by conducting independent QED or RCT evaluations that are multi-site, or by conducting multiple independent impact evaluations at different sites or with different populations. The results need to be consistently positive across those sites or with those multiple populations. And of course, the reports need to be of the same intervention described in the application. Here's an example of a hypothetical strong evidence applicant. Applicant's Ready to Read program provides tutoring services in 25 states across the country. The program hired an independent evaluator to conduct a randomized controlled trial in 16 states, including both rural and urban sites, as well as student populations with different racial and ethnic backgrounds. The evaluation found that students in the Ready to Read program outperformed students in the control group on 3 specific literacy skills addressed by the program. The results were statistically significant with moderate effect sizes. Subgroup analysis showed positive impacts in both rural and urban settings and across multiple ethnic and racial groups. Additional documents: the applicant submitted one independent evaluation report from the Ready to Read program describing the results of the RCT study. You'll notice here that the applicant submitted only one report, but the report covers multiple sites with multiple population variations, and the positive impacts were seen in each of them. This is why the applicant is assessed as having strong evidence rather than moderate evidence. Evidence quality, again, will be assessed based on the details in the submitted evaluation report itself. Notice that the report in this case is from the applicant's own project, but it wouldn't have to be. The applicant could also have submitted an evaluation report or study from a program model they are replicating with fidelity. So as you've seen, as we've discussed these evidence tiers, applicants have to submit reports or studies with their application in order to be considered for anything above the pre-preliminary evidence tier. So preliminary, moderate, or strong evidence all require submission of reports or studies. All applicants are allowed to submit up to 2 studies or evaluation reports. For applicants that are required to submit an evaluation report to meet their own evaluation requirements, they are allowed to submit up to 3 studies. So the required evaluation report can be submitted in addition to the usual two. At this point, you are very tired of me saying the words same intervention, but I'm going to say it again anyway. Submitted reports or studies will only be considered if the intervention in the study matches the intervention proposed in the grant application. Please read carefully the definition of same intervention in the Mandatory Supplemental Guidance, and be sure to describe in your application how your definition is met, how that definition is met in your specific case. If you're interested in details about the mechanics of how to submit evidence reports or studies along with your application, those instructions are in the 2020 NOFO and application instructions. Please be sure to follow those instructions and follow the required timeline very carefully. Now, in addition to evidence tier, reviewers also assess the evidence quality for AmeriCorps applicants. As I mentioned earlier, the evidence quality criteria are going to differ based on the assessed evidence tier. This slide shows the evidence quality criteria for applicants in the pre-preliminary evidence tier. And I've highlighted important words in the definition in blue, in the criteria in blue. Criteria 1, the applicant uses relevant evidence, including past performance measure data and/or cited research studies, to inform their proposed program design. Second criterion, the described evidence is relatively recent, preferably from the last 6 years. Third criterion, the evidence described by the applicant indicates a meaningful positive effect on program beneficiaries in at least one key outcome of interest. You can see here that these criteria are tailored to evidence-informed applicants, programs that don't yet have evidence to support their specific intervention design. These applicants need to demonstrate in the application narrative, notice that note on the bottom of the slide, demonstrate in the narrative that the program design is informed by recent relevant evidence that shows a meaningful positive effect on program beneficiaries. Let me call out a moment, that's program beneficiaries, the people served by the program, not AmeriCorps members in this case. As a reminder, evidence quality is a threshold issue for applicants in the pre-preliminary evidence tier. They must provide adequate responses to the evidence quality criteria in order to be considered for funding. This next slide shows the evidence quality criteria for applicants in the higher evidence tiers, the preliminary, moderate, or strong evidence tier. And once again, I've highlighted important words in these criteria in blue. The submitted reports are of satisfactory methodological quality and rigor for the type of evaluation conducted, e.g. adequate sample size and statistical power, internal and/or external validity, appropriate use of control or comparison groups, and so forth. Second criterion, the submitted reports describe evaluations that were conducted relatively recently, preferably within the last 6 years. Third criterion, the submitted reports show a meaningful and significant positive effect on program beneficiaries in at least one key outcome of interest. These criteria are tailored to evidence-based applicants or applicants that are progressing toward becoming evidence-based. In other words, programs who do have evaluation reports or studies that support their specific intervention design. These applicants need to demonstrate in the submitted reports or studies themselves, notice that note at the bottom of this slide, so in the reports themselves, the reports need to show that their evidence has satisfactory methodology, is relatively recent, and shows a meaningful and significant positive effect on program beneficiaries. Again, the individuals served by the program. I want to digress for just a moment to talk about a couple of other evaluation-related items that get submitted as part of an AmeriCorps grant application. Applicants who have not received competitive funding before are required to submit a data collection plan with their application, and recompeting competitive applicants who have received competitive funding in the past are required to submit an evaluation plan. The key thing to keep in mind is that these plans are not part of the competitive application review process. They will be reviewed, but not until after funding decisions are made. So it's important to remember that any information you provide in these plans is not going to be considered as part of an applicant's evidence base, and it's not going to affect the applicant's evidence tier or evidence quality. Instead, all of the scored evidence criteria, tier and quality, must be addressed in the main portion of the application narrative and in the submitted evidence reports. So I know there's some questions that have come in. Thank you for that. We will take those questions momentarily. I just wanted to give a couple of tips for AmeriCorps grant applicants when it comes to addressing the evidence criteria in the application. First, read the instructions. That is the bullet in bold on this slide. Read the instructions in the NOFO and the Mandatory Supplemental Guidance. The definitions of each evidence tier are carefully and intentionally written, and so is the language of the evidence quality criteria. And the instructions for when and how to submit evaluation reports or studies are essential to make sure that you're considered for the correct evidence tier. Please follow this written guidance to the letter. Second, please follow the instructions in the NOFO by describing the full body of evidence for your intervention in the application narrative. Do this even if you are submitting studies to be considered for a higher evidence tier. If those studies are determined not to qualify as the same intervention, then only the content of the application narrative gets considered as evidence. If this happens, and if you haven't included adequate information in the narrative to demonstrate evidence quality, you will not meet the threshold requirements for funding. Third, please describe in the application narrative how the intervention in your submitted reports or studies is the same as the intervention proposed in the application. It may be obvious to you, truly it may be obvious to you that it is the same, but chances are it probably isn't obvious to a third-party reviewer reading your application. Use the criteria in the same intervention definition and explain point by point how the interventions match each other. If you don't do that, you are vulnerable to having your submitted reports disregarded as not being of the same intervention. Fourth, please be aware of the limits on the number of studies or reports you can submit. Every year, there is some applicant who submits 10 studies, and 8 of those studies can't be reviewed or considered at all. Doing that leaves you vulnerable to having your best quality studies thrown out, and it also drives us nuts here at CNCS. So please don't be that applicant. Choose your 2 or 3 best quality studies and submit only those. And if the studies aren't of the same intervention as defined in the Mandatory Supplemental Guidance, please do not submit them. Finally, consider evidence quality when you decide which 2 or 3 studies to submit. A QED or RCT study that isn't properly done or that doesn't show a meaningful positive effect is not going to do you any favors. Stick to evidence that fits those blue highlighted words in the evidence quality criteria: rigorous, relevant, recent, meaningful. I'm going to leave this slide up for a while as we move into questions, but I want to make you aware of resources that will be helpful to you in demonstrating evidence in your grant applications. First link you see here is the 2020 Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO page. This is where you will find the text of the NOFO and the Mandatory Supplemental Guidance. These are the documents that have detailed definitions for all of the evidence tiers and evidence quality criteria, as well as the instructions for submitting evidence reports. The next link you see is the Evaluation Resources page on the Knowledge Network. This will help you understand different types of evaluation designs and how you can use evaluation to build the evidence base for your program and move along that evidence continuum. There are training materials on the site that will walk you through the evaluation process, from planning through implementation, through using the results of your evaluation to inform program improvement. And finally, in the Evidence Exchange, which is the third link, you'll find a searchable repository of evaluation reports from other national service programs and grantees. If you are interested in adapting or replicating an existing intervention, this is a great place to start. And I'll call your attention especially to 3 evidence briefs on this website. They are called out in the 2020 NOFO in the priority areas. These briefs can connect you to information and evaluation results for evidence-based program models in education, healthy futures, and economic opportunity. So I have now talked a lot at you. This concludes the formal part of the presentation. So now we will move into questions and answers. Roshni and I are both here to answer those questions. So let's take a look at what is in the question and answer box already. The first question says, could you give examples of replication programs? Would it have to be another AmeriCorps program? So the quick answer is no, it doesn't have to be another AmeriCorps program. What matters is that it matches those 5 dimensions of program design that we talked about on previous slides, the things that make something the same intervention. Those are the areas that have to match. So the characteristics of the population delivering the intervention need to be the same or very similar. But status as a AmeriCorps member or not is generally not the essential thing here. Probably has more to do with demographics, level of education, training, and so forth. So thanks for that question. The next question is, would your example of the pre-preliminary level program have to explain why they aren't using the same dosage? Although you gave examples of why and that they're only claiming evidence informed. It would be a good idea to do that, yes. I think if you are choosing to intentionally modify an evidence-based program design, it would be really helpful to know why. Otherwise, it looks like you're moving away, potentially making a bad decision and moving away from something that you knew would work. So yes, it is not required that you explain it, but it would definitely be a best practice to do that. Next question, how would you suggest addressing a QED or RCT evaluation that returned neutral results or undermined results? Say the independent evaluator doesn't find overly positive results. Would you still submit and describe the attempt, or focus on informed evidence or program measures that show positive outcomes? So I guess one thing I would say up front is that evaluations that return neutral or undetermined results are still valuable to a program. They still provide essential information that helps the program grow and improve. So I would never suggest that a program pretend that evaluation does not exist. It's important, and they should talk openly about it and talk about how they are using those results to improve their program. That being said, a evaluation report that has neutral or undetermined results is not going to contribute toward an evidence tier determination. So it's not a report that will help somebody get to moderate or strong evidence. It probably would be something to talk about in the application as, again, a basis for making some modifications to the program design. Mm-hmm. Roshni, anything to add to that?
No.
All right.
Exactly what you said. I would just, again, look into why it didn't yield the results you expected it to yield, to use it for program improvement.
All right, great. Thanks for that question. Next question, for your strong evidence example with 16 states and multiple generalizable components, could a national direct program in a different state submit that study as their evidence? And then in parentheses, it says replicated with fidelity. So the key question here, and when we're talking about evidence that supports an application, the key question is it the same intervention? So if it is the case that this program design is being replicated with fidelity in a different site, then yes, this report could be used to support this application and to provide evidence for the application. That is different from whether that report could be used to meet the evaluation requirements for an application. That would not be possible. To meet the evaluation requirements for an application, one or more sites from that program need to be included in the evaluation. That's a whole other webinar, and I will refer you to a recording from a couple of weeks ago where we talked about evaluation policy and provided guidance about exactly that, whether or not reports from different sites could be used to meet evaluation requirements. Here we're talking specifically about evidence supporting an intervention, a proposed intervention, and in that case, all that matters is whether or not the intervention qualifies as the same. The sites do not matter. Okay, thank you for the question. Next question, for pre-preliminary described evidence being relatively recent, do you mean the program's outcomes or cited research relevant to the program? Should we not cite studies that are more than 6 years old? So it's not an absolute either or. What we're saying is that evidence quality would be considered higher for studies or for outcome data that is more recent. So if you measured program outcomes last year, it might not be a formal evaluation report, but that would be recent evidence that you could describe in an application to support pre-preliminary evidence. If you have a research report that you're describing and it happens to be 10 years old, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't describe it. If that provides solid evidence that guides your program design, you can still describe it. It just means that we would not consider the evidence quality to be quite as high because it is a little bit older. Roshni, want to add to that?
No.
Okay.
Definitely.
Last question that we have open at the moment is, what does CNCS deem to be an adequate sample size? Roshni, that is all yours.
I would recommend there is no one size fits all, so you would have to do a power analysis to determine what the right sample size for your study would be.
And if you don't know how to do a power analysis, we have a evaluation technical assistance provider, NORC, that has a technical assistance portal. It is available to all current competitively funded grantees, AmeriCorps state and national grantees. So if the person who asked this question, if you are an existing competitively funded AmeriCorps state or national grantee, you are welcome to submit a request for technical assistance through that portal, and you can ask questions about power analysis and how to navigate that.
Thank you for that.
I don't see any more open questions at the moment. Oh, something else just popped up. Where in your application do you describe that a program is a replication of another program? Is this in the evidence-based section where you describe the replicated program's evidence, or in a different part of the application? I'm going to refer you back to the NOFO. The NOFO will walk you through the different sections of the application and what the criteria are for each one. And you will see in the language of the NOFO where it tells you to describe the intervention and to explain how it is the same intervention as the intervention described in a report that you're submitting. So just take a look at the guidance in there in terms of where exactly to put it in the application. All right, I don't see any more questions. Oh, I do see one more question. Should you also mention it in the theory of change? So again, theory of change is part of the application. There is an application narrative section. There's also a logic model. Both of those contribute toward your description of the theory of change. Do take a look at the NOFO in terms of the details of how to fit it in the context of the application narrative and the logic model. All right, so can you give the link to access the request for technical assistance? You know what, I don't have the link right in front of me at the moment. However, if you go to the second link that's displaying on this page right here, the one that says evaluation resources on the Knowledge Network, if you access that link, then linked from that page is a direct link to the technical assistance portal. So while I don't have that exact link, you can get there through one click by following the second link on the slide that's displaying right now. All right, I love these just-in-time questions that are flowing in. Please continue to pop in additional questions in the next couple of minutes if you have them. My colleague Brittany Tonning, our training manager, is sitting here in the room being the technical force behind the webinar here. I'll give you a moment to talk about just sort of the general technical assistance series that we've done for the NOFO.
Of course, thank you, Sarah. So this is a good time just to remind everyone on the line that we have had a series of other webinars in the weeks previous to this one. All of those recordings are available on the NOFO page, which I think is the first link that is currently displayed on your screen. So if you missed any of the webinars from the GARP series, Technical Assistance series that we've had, you can access those recordings and materials on the NOFO page. This webinar will also be uploaded in the next couple of days, so you can revisit it if you, missed a certain section or you wanted to revisit as part of the conversation. That will also be available to you.
All right, we are pausing for another second. Take a look at the question and answer portal. Not seeing any other open questions pop up. So I think at this point, we will go ahead and conclude for the day. If you do end up having additional questions that come into your mind right after this webinar concludes, then you can either send them to AmeriCorps.grants@cns.gov. That's the email address that we've set up to answer application-related questions, or you can use one of the resources listed on the slide you see right here. Again, especially the evaluation resources page on the Knowledge Network connects you to that technical assistance portal if you need it. And Brittany has just put that AmeriCorps Grants email address in the chat so that you can see that if you need it. Meanwhile, thank you so much for joining today's webinar. Best of luck with preparing your applications, and have a great rest of your day.